Welcome. My name is Haley Seufer, CEO of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, the voice and political home for Jewish voters in support of Democrats who share our values. Since Hamas's horrific attack on October 7th, JDCA has convened our community weekly to hear from elected officials, policy experts, and Jewish community leaders. Since we last met, we've been incredibly grateful to see the release of hostages, thanks in part to the leadership of President Biden, and remain committed to ensuring the many more men, women, and children still being held in Gaza are immediately released. We're grateful to the hundreds of you who have joined us today to hear about these and other issues from former House Majority Leader Representative Steny Hoyer, who will share his unique perspective based on his longstanding experience and engagement with Israel. We are also honored to be joined today by First Lady of the State of Israel, Mrs. Michal Herzog, to discuss the global response to the unconscionable acts of sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas. The international response to Hamas's use of sexual violence as an act of war has been deafening and deeply disappointing silence. This is why JDCA has called on members of Congress to take action and sign a bipartisan letter in the House calling on UN women to condemn Hamas. It's a vitally important issue, and we look forward to hearing more from First Lady Herzog about the critically important effort underway to draw global attention to the silence of the international community and condemn Hamas. Our first guest today, Representative Steny Hoyer, has served the people of Maryland's 5th Congressional District since 1981, where he's been an exceptional ally of the Jewish community and Israel. In the 117th Congress, he served as House Majority Leader, the second-ranking member of the House Democratic leadership, where he played a key role shaping national security and defending our shared values, including leading efforts to defend democracy, support the U.S.-Israel relationship, and combat anti-Semitism. Representative Hoyer, we are grateful to have you here. So we will get started. This past August, you traveled with more than 20 Democrats to Israel, and you visited Kibbutz Kfar Aza in the south. We know, of course, this kibbutz was one of many that was brutally attacked on October 7th. When we think about this horrific day, there's so much devastation that it's easy to lose sight of each impacted community, family, and individual in Israel. What have you learned about how these attacks have impacted the Kfar Aza community specifically, which, in addition to visiting this summer, we know you have visited 3 times before?
Well, it was a site of obviously carnage, murder, atrocities, reminiscent of the Holocaust, and evidencing absolutely immoral, sadistic, terrible, terrible violence. Tragically, of course, we know that the Jewish people have been subjected to hate and prejudice for millennia, thousands of years as diaspora. And sadly, we still see that occurring. As a matter of fact, we know that anti-Semitism is on the steep rise since October 7th, sadly and tragically. But, we walked the streets and the walkways of the kibbutz. We met people there. They were a community, and they were turned into a killing field. They were living on property that is Israel's, that's uncontested as Israel's. Yet they were violated and murdered. And as we know, rape has been used, as it has been in so many different areas of the world, used as an act of war, as an act of intimidation, clearly a war crime. But it is so sad, having walked through a peaceful, positive, happy kibbutz, and to talk to the people there. And questions are always asked, well, why do you stay here with Gaza so in such proximity, in such danger, and with only seconds to protect yourself in a safe room? from rockets that are coming in? And the answer almost always is because there's no place to run. And what they mean by that, of course, is there's no place that has been a safe place, a secure place. Probably the two safest places in the world have been Israel itself and the United States of America. And even here, we are fighting anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence, so that our response needs to be very, very certain. We need to, I've got a sign in front of my office, we stand with Israel. And we need to make that very clear, because if we don't, and if we don't complete the job that Israel has begun in response to this tragedy, we will be condemned to continue to live it.
Thank you. Well, we know you have done just that. You have stood with Israel both before October 7th and certainly in the aftermath of this horrific attack. How do you assess the response of other Democrats, including President Biden, to the horror that we saw on October 7th? And what more can we do as Democrats to support Israel and ensure the continued release of hostages?
Haley, when President Biden gave his first speech, my response was, he speaks for me. He speaks for America. And I hope that we continue to have that kind of consensus and commitment to freedom and democracy and international law that the Hamas attack so violently abused and put in question. So I think that we have a big consensus. I think there are over 415 members of the 435 who absolutely are going to vote to continue to support Israel. I was very sad, frankly, when the Republican majority offered a $14 billion support for Israel, which would have had overwhelming, well over 400 votes in support of it, but then added a provision which clearly was a conditional assist to Israel, but only on the basis if we took an extraneous matter that clearly did not have consensus. We haven't done that before. We ought not to be doing it now. And I'm urging Speaker Johnson to bring to the floor immediately a legislation which will send $14 billion to Israel to make sure that it has the resources, the weapons, the ability to accomplish the objective of eliminating Hamas. I was with Prime Minister Sharon on August 15th, 2005, which was the day before Israel withdrew from Gaza. And he talked about the risks. And this was about between 5 and 7 at night, which was, and of course, at 12 o'clock, they began the evacuation from Gaza. And the hope, of course, was, okay, fine, you're in charge, the PLA. And then, of course, we had Hamas, a terrorist organization recognized around the world as a terrorist organization, by force, took it over. And from that point to now, has followed its determination to both kill Jews and eliminate Israel as a state, certainly as a Jewish state, but as a state at all. We have seen that every time there's a ceasefire, every time there's a stop in the Israeli response, there's a temporary peace, or at least not peace, but a cessation of assault by rockets, and then it returns. So Israel's conclusion, I agree with 100% that the only response now needs to be the elimination of Hamas, and the world needs to stand with Israel in that objective, because it can see readily the experience has been that that's the only way violence stops. That's the only way Israeli citizens are not put at risk. It's the only way that the effort to eliminate Israel as a state, as a Jewish state, is going to cease.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned the assistance. It's very important, and we know that earlier this month that Republicans led a bill that put this $14.4 billion of aid into Israel for the first time in the bill, and it conditioned the aid on unnecessary spending cuts. But this aid is essential and it must go forward, and it does not need in any way to be conditioned or to have an offset. So, what are the next
Haley,
steps
can I
toward
can I stop you at that
Yes,
point?
yes.
Because I want to add, nobody who voted either for or against that, and Democrats voted overwhelmingly against it because we wanted a clean bill, which we knew could pass the Senate. Nobody believed that bill was going to pass the United States Senate. So it was essentially a pretense of support, not real support. Real support will be if we move a bill that has the $14.4 billion, which may or may not be enough, and we don't know for what time that will go on, and obviously it will depend upon how long the conflict continues. But not only did it include a condition, but it included a condition that the sponsors knew would not pass, and therefore was not real aid to Israel. And that's a shame, because I have worked with scores, literally scores of Republican leaders, Roy Blunt, Eric Cantor, as far back as Trent Lott 30 years ago, in making sure that we had bipartisan, overwhelming agreement on support of Israel, whatever the issue was. And this is unfortunately, a time when that did not prevail, and the consequences were now we've gone over almost 2 months now without sending the money that Israel needs and the resources it needs to make sure that it can be successful in its objective.
But just because this is so important, what are the next steps toward passing this military assistance toward Israel, for Israel, as well as the aid for Ukraine and humanitarian assistance for the Palestinian people, which Israel also supports? What are the next steps?
Well, I'm glad you added Ukraine. I was going to mention that. In Ukraine and Israel, we see at risk freedom and democracy and the rule of international law. Both issues are raised in both of those countries. In one instance, we have what essentially is a terrorist leader, Vladimir Putin, deciding that he wants to, contrary to an agreement he made in 2014, attack Ukraine without cause and with deadly consequences to thousands of people. And in Israel, of course, Hamas, which has as its objective, its political objective, to kill Jews and eliminate Israel. And it states it boldly. And why there aren't scores of resolutions on a regular basis in the United Nations condemning Hamas and condemning supporters of Hamas, either militarily or politically or rhetorically, is beyond me. But they're not. And I am urging the Speaker to bring to the floor the $14.4 billion bill clean, and by that I mean without any other facets to it, because clean, it will have over 400 votes. It'll have 95% of the House and maybe 100% of the House. I don't know 100%, but overwhelming consensus, Republicans and Democrats committed to the defense of freedom and democracy and the ability of nations to live securely within international law. And Israel should have that same right. And particularly because Israel is so closely aligned with the United States of America, we share the values of democracy, the values of freedom. And that's what ought to happen. And I'm hopeful, certainly, that we will not go home for a Christmas holiday break before we send Israel $14.4 billion and send $61 billion to Ukraine. If we do so, we will send a terrible message, both to our friends and to our enemies, of a lack of resolve, a lack of commitment by the United States of America to defense of freedom and democracy here and around the world. So that I am very hopeful that within the next few days, the next 14 days, we will pass both Ukrainian aid and aid for Israel in this effort that is a joint effort. We're not on the ground, but we are there, and we will remain there, as President Biden says, and we will not falter, and we will not flag, and we will not bow our heads to those who would try to terrorize the world and their neighbors. So we need to do something in the next 14 days. We need to get this done.
We definitely share your commitment to trying to get that aid passed. And we have a call to action as well, which we'll put in the chat so everyone can write to their member of Congress, urging them to do all they can to pass that assistance. Congressman, since October 7th, you have made clear that you joined President Biden in warning Iran and its terrorist proxy Hezbollah not to escalate the conflict further. While there has been some unrest, there has not been a large-scale escalation. But what is the path forward to ensure that there is no escalation of this conflict with Iran?
Well, clearly, the president visited Israel at a time of war, which is a very unusual thing for a president to do, and the right thing for the president to do. And that message was, we are with Israel. Not ifs, ands, or buts. We are with Israel. And he also sent the message, if you're thinking of getting involved in this, whether you're a Hezbollah, whether you're Iran, whether you're Russia, whoever you might be, don't. That was his message. Don't. And he backed that up by sending 2 carrier groups to the Mediterranean. And with all the power that they represent and the resolve that they represent. And of course, we've also seen Iran attacking U.S. deployments in Syria, and we've responded. And we've told Hezbollah and others, ISIS and others, any group that wants to join in this and take advantage of this horrific act by Hamas to further widen the war, don't. And I am very hopeful that they don't. And if they do, that we respond accordingly to make sure that Israel is not the victim of a surrounding force of lawbreakers and murderers. Why? Because Israel's survival is necessary for the survival of freedom around the world. Why is that? Because if we cannot protect an ally that is so closely identified with us and in values and in historical relationships, such a great friend and ally, then I think allies all over the world will wonder whether America will stand with them at their time of challenge. So it's not just about Israel. It's about the kind of world in which we're going to live, the kind of peace that we can bring, and the kind of international law that we can support.
Thank you. Well, as our last question, I want to thank you for your concerted, ongoing, and principled leadership for decades on issues of importance to Jewish voters, including the defense of our democracy, support of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and efforts to combat anti-Semitism and hate. What drives your commitment on these issues, and what gives you hope about the future?
I got into politics. John Kennedy came to the University of Maryland, and I was very inspired by what he had to say and what he did, and got into politics because I was, I think, a junior at the University of Maryland when he came there, and not too many years thereafter, 7 to be exact, I was elected to the state senate 5 months out of Georgetown Law School because I was inspired by him to uphold peace, uphold international law. You'll recall his inaugural address, we will pay any price, bear any burden to defend freedom here and around the world. And he had written a book, Why England Slept, and essentially the United States as well. As Hitler started his scourge, the world watched and waited and did very little. And frankly, Roosevelt did some things, and Lend-Lease and things of that nature, but the world did not respond. And as a result, Hitler thought he could continue to do what he did, and he did until he overran Europe. And it was ended by the Second World War, in which all the world got engaged at a horrific cost. And when we see terrorists raise their head, or a nation state led by a terrorist, Vladimir Putin, takes action, and there is not a response from the free world, from the world that honors international law, that honors morals, that honors the values of freedom, then those who do not value them think they have license to act. And I think that's what motivates me, that the need to respond. And it's not just in terms of war, but when we see anti-Semitism, or we see other forms of prejudice and hate, either rhetorically or physically directed at people, we need to respond. I've got next to the sign, "We stand with Israel," outside my front door, the office, is a statement by John Lewis. If you see something that's not right, that's not just, that's not fair, you need to stand up. You need to speak up. You need to speak out. You need to act. And I think what John Lewis said in the context of civil rights is also true in the arena of international rights, of civil rights, of human rights, of rights that have shown to be a touchstone for principled civil society and international communities. That's what motivates me, and I think the United Nations established. It wasn't the Israelis. This was not imposed by force. It had to be retained by force, but it was established by a vote of the United Nations, saying that post-World War II, there needed to be a place of refuge and security for the Jewish people. And so the United Nations established this. And as we all know, Jews accepted the parameters that were established, and the Arab communities did not. And as a result, the Palestinian people have been put at great risk by their very leaders, not by the Israelis, but by their own leaders. And we need to accomplish ultimately a two-state solution. But as long as Hamas and others exist, as long as there are voices of hate and violence and objectives to kill and to eliminate that which the United Nations created, there will be no peace. And I think that's what motivates me.
Thank you so much for your leadership and your conviction. We deeply appreciate it. And I'm now going to turn it over to someone whom you know very well. We're proud to have him as a part of our organization. He's Daniel Silverberg is on our New Leaders Council. Daniel.
Hey, Daniel. Good afternoon, Mr. Hoyer. Thank you so much. As Haley mentioned, I'm a proud alumnus of your office, Mr. Hoyer, and in the amazing work that you do. And I'm also a member of the JDCA's Young Leadership Forum. Mr. Hoyer, you are welcome to be part of our Young Leaders Forum as well, of course, since I think
well, that was the nicest thing anybody's going to say to me today. I want to say, and I am proud to have been a student of and continue to be a student of Daniel Silverberg's.
You're very kind. I do want to flag for everyone that among many leadership lessons that I learned from you, one of the most important ones was getting 400 plus votes on an Israel measure is what matters. It's not so much the specifics, it's getting that clear statement of support. And the only way that happens is through the kind of deft diplomacy and commitment that I think everyone on this call has experienced in a brief window. So thank you for that. Thank you for letting me also, as you say, be off the payroll, but still effectively be part of the staff. So thank you. I want to introduce our JDCA Treasurer and Budget Committee Director, Beth Kiefer-Leonard, who's going to introduce the guest that we are so honored and delighted to have with us, the First Lady of the State of Israel, Michal Herzog. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate it. We are most fortunate today to have the First Lady of the State of Israel, Michal Herzog, join us. In addition to her tireless work as the First Lady, she is a lawyer and professional mediator who has worked to advance social, educational, and health issues in Israel. Over the years, Michal Herzog has served as board member for numerous public organizations supporting people with disabilities, caring for youth at risk, and promoting social mobility. In her capacity as First Lady of Israel, Michal is actively involved in fighting against mental health stereotypes and fostering open discourse about that subject, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and its significant impact on children and teenagers. On November 22nd, the First Lady of State of Israel, Herzog, penned an op-ed in Newsweek titled, "The silence from international bodies over Hamas's mass rapes is a betrayal of all women." She is here with us today to discuss, among other things, Hamas's use of sexual violence during the October 7th attack. As her friend, I am proud that this important issue has been elevated critically and that we are honored to welcome her today to speak to us with JDCA. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. It's my honor to be here with you, and I want to thank Congressman Hoyer very, very much for his very kind words and his very strong and message and moral clarity throughout, and especially during these difficult times. And I want to say that I'm not sure that we still understand what happened. I'm not sure that we understand all the ramifications. We don't understand the numbers. We're a very small country. The sheer numbers of victims during the October 7th attack are tremendous. It will take us some time to understand, to actually grasp what this means. As I said, we're all affected. We're a small place. We all have someone who was attacked, someone who was living there, someone who was murdered in the Nova Music Festival, Jews and non-Jews. I'm not sure everyone is aware of the number of Muslims that were killed on October 7th. Over 40 were killed. There are hostages, Muslim Bedouin hostages held now in Gaza, and the numbers are terrifying. And one of the things that took us some time to understand was the effect, the cruelty towards women on October 7th. It took me a few days to understand the meaning of that. Because the first time I heard was, as you know, in the past few months before the October 7th attack, we were all discussing in Israel the issues of the judicial reform, the pros and cons. Israel was split around that. And on October 7th, just like in a minute, all the energies of the NGOs that were active in the fight against the judicial reform turned their energies into helping Israeli society at large. This was something really amazing that happened during that day. So a few days after the October 7th attack, I visited one of those very feminist motivated organizations. They set up a special center to deal with issues, especially of women from the south of Israel, single women that needed more help. They were afraid, as happens in crises like these, that domestic violence would be on the rise. So I went to visit one of those NGOs. You all know them from The Handmaid's Tale, the ones wearing red. And they actually told me in confidence that some of their volunteers were also volunteers in rape crisis centers. And they were starting to hear from survivors of the attack, from the music festival, from the kibbutzim, that the gender-based violence was exceptionally cruel. Of course, unfortunately, most of the victims were not there to voice out what they went through because they were murdered. And so, but some of the survivors and witnesses came out very, very slowly in the beginning with the stories, with the atrocities, with the cruel attacks, especially on women. And so I heard that first there, and then I started looking into it. And many women organizations in Israel have been starting to talk about it. And the more they looked into it, more witnesses came out, more horror stories, and horrific descriptions from first responders. That was the terrible thing. First responders who were there on the scene and found the bodies came out with, I don't want to go into graphic descriptions, but it was very, very difficult to hear. And as these witnesses came with more and more stories and facts, many of my colleagues, I'm a lawyer myself, and many of my colleagues who spent their lifetime actually working for women's rights in international organizations, presented these to human rights organizations and women organizations around the world, and of course to the UN. And nothing, there was nothing, there was no response. I must tell you that a friend of mine, Professor Ruth Alperin Kadari, who has been in the forefront of fighting internationally for women's rights. She was actually a member of the UN Commission for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. She was the deputy chairman. She was there for 12 years. She told me in tears, I don't know where my colleagues are. I don't know what happened. They felt that the silence, especially of UN women and organizations that were set up exactly for this purpose, for the purpose of preventing violence against women, of preventing the use of the bodies of women as weapons of war, they just did not react. No condemnation at all. Just last Friday, I think, the UN women came out with the first sort of condemnation. They said they were alarmed by what happened on October 7th, without really mentioning the word Hamas or Israeli women attacked. They were alarmed. You know what my reaction is? I'm alarmed that this is their reaction, and this is the toughest word that they can find. So especially as we marked on Saturday, this last Saturday, November 25th, the International Day set by the UN for the elimination of violence against women, I thought this was ridiculous. Ridiculous, disappointing. It felt like a betrayal of Israeli women. And it's not just Israeli women. It's Israeli women now. It may be other women in the future. And as we all know, that the Hamas attack is really a fight of civilizations. It is not just against Israel. Israel is there first. We're fighting, but we're fighting for the world that we know, the world we all share, of values, of democracy, of human rights. And this is why it felt like such a betrayal, especially for Israeli women. And this is why I came out with this, and many of my colleagues. And as I mentioned, Professor Kadari was even asked by Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield to come and present at a session that was dedicated to violence against women at the Security Council at the UN, but she was not allowed to bring her to the session. So, you know, what can we say? We feel it's a betrayal. I'm hoping that maybe some of the human rights organizations, some of the women rights international organizations will come to their senses and will understand that they have to come out, they have to shout out to prevent the next violent events. And, you know, the role of women in Israel as fighters, even as commanders, was seen on October 7th. There's no argument that women can do anything, they're strong, that they can be at the forefront of anything that they wish to do. And there have been a few arguments here and there, if anything in the military can be opened up, any role for women. And I think the women's superheroism on October 7th was proof of that. But the other side was also the gender-based, cruel violence against women. And it's continuing now because as there are hostages still in Gaza, still young women, still in captivity, we don't know what's going on there. We will only know when they get back. And this is another part of the violence, is the civilian hostages that are being held, hostages including young soldiers and young female soldiers as well, that are being held in captivity. We will only be able to know what happened when they are released and we see them back home. And until then, it's an ongoing violence and gender-based violence against women. But I also want to say that we should look at the hopeful side of things as well. You know, we will be celebrating the Feast of Light, Hanukkah, in a few days' time. And everyone here in Israel is seeing this as a symbolic date of bringing light to everyone, bringing hope to everyone. And the solidarity in Israeli civil society has been amazing. Everyone has been feeling responsible for each other, feeling the strength of the togetherness. And I hope that the next few days will also bring good news as we see more and more hostages, but we have to insist on seeing all of them come back home. And I also want to tell you and share with you what I've seen on our southern border this morning. The president and I were visiting down south this morning in some of the, not necessarily the kibbutzim, but also the other communities on the border. This is one of the main areas of agriculture in Israel, and they have been really suffering from the situation. It is now most of it closed military zones, so they have to milk the cows and pick the peppers and the avocados, and there's a lot of difficulties around that. But what we also saw, we went to the Nitzana crossing, which is the crossing through which the humanitarian aid comes into Gaza every day now. There are over 200 trucks sent in from Egypt to Gaza through that crossing every day. I was really amazed, I must say, at the organization, at the coordination between Egypt and Israel on that issue, and the international efforts. And I can tell you that there were so many people involved and so much caring about preventing a humanitarian crisis in South Gaza. We know that it is a difficult time, and I want to share my concern for every innocent civilian in Gaza that is living under very difficult circumstances now. But I can assure you that Israel is doing its utmost, and the blame is on Hamas, that is using the civilians in Gaza as human shields and is preventing some of the aid that goes through. And I do hope that that situation changes as well.
Thank you so much for all of the comments and description. Before we leave the issues of the women, I'd like to just go back to one thing from your article in Newsweek. And it's more about the silence that we've heard, but what can we do to raise our voices to help? Is there something that we have a whole army here on this call, and an army that we're willing to mobilize? How can we help raise this issue, not only through Jewish voices, but through other voices in certainly in America?
I think just constantly raise the issue. Just constantly talk about it, raise the issue, give facts. If people need facts, we can provide them, numbers, facts. This is not, as I said, this is not just an Israeli women's issue. This is an international issue because we are there at the front, but it may happen to someone else. And if the UN women, for example, choose to be one-sided, then they can do that in other conflicts as well. And we want to prevent that.
I think that's probably one of the most important parts of the message, is that it is, what happens the next time? How are we discerning between who we defend and who we don't defend? One of the things, so we've all watched, as you all have, you're 8 hours ahead of us in Minnesota, but our phones are never off to watch the hostage exchange each day. Can you describe for us what it feels like in Israel, the duality of the complexity of the feelings, those that are being reunited, and then those we know that are still left behind? How is the Israeli public responding to each of these hostage exchanges and the difficulty that it all brings about?
So if there's something that is very clear for every single Israeli, is that all the hostages have to come back home. And I must commend the families. You know, the conversations with the families of the hostages have been the most difficult conversations the president and I had in our lifetime. You face a family that is in the unknown. They don't know if their dear ones are alive or not. What are the conditions? When will they come back? These conversations were very difficult. And now that the process of returning the hostages home has begun, the families have been fabulous. I think they're very generous. Their generosity of heart towards each other is amazing, because the families that got their dear ones back, sometimes not all of them, sometimes it's part of a family and the father or husband is left behind. The first thing they have been saying is, we are with you until everyone comes back. We may have seen our dear ones back, but we're still with you. And the togetherness of this group of families that are from all over society. They didn't know each other before, but this has really brought them together, and it's very moving to see the reactions and their dedication to each other. As for the general public, I must say, you know, I've been calling it ISIS roulette or Hamas roulette. Every evening now, this is a roulette, because you don't know. They are such a cruel enemy, and they use psychological warfare. And they know how much Israelis care about every single person. So they play a game. They give the list the very last moment of who is going to be freed tonight. They don't know. They don't announce the time. They don't know. They sometimes change the route. They come through a longer way. They come through a shorter way. So this is like roulette for us. Everyone sits glued to the TV, trying to catch a glimpse of, maybe you recognize someone. Maybe there's a young child. Maybe there isn't. You know, we're all on edge now because we feel now that we all know them. For instance, Kfir, the 10-month-old baby that Hamas today announced that his family, he and his mother and 4-year-old brother were killed. We don't know if that's true or not. We don't know where they are, what is their condition. And so everyone is very involved in this, and it's been very, very difficult. But as I said, there's hope when you see them coming back. And there's hope when you see Abigail coming back to her family. It's very tragic because she doesn't have parents anymore. But that's where we are now.
Thank you. I think I mean, we all were watching it and seeing it, but it's when you're in it, it's even more dramatic, the emotions, and it's a roller coaster every day. Without getting too political, even though that's what we are in this organization. And you just heard Congressman Hoyer describe significant support. Just want to talk about President Biden's role. So he continues to firmly support Israel and lead the United States with moral clarity on this crisis. It's been amazing. And Congressman Hoyer also mentioned, you know, going to a war zone as a president is incredible. So the Biden administration continues to play a significant role in everything that's going on, including the negotiations. I think Secretary of State Blinken is there again today. Can't remember. He was back
Tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning.
Yeah. But there is no higher priority, as you've heard about, that we're supporting the purpose and returning the hostages. So how is President Biden leadership perceived in Israel? It's something, now I have to say, when I was there, it was the first time I saw a "Thank you, President Biden" sign on the highway. That was pretty amazing. But here we are, 50 plus days later. What's the feeling?
First of all, I think we're very, very grateful for his leadership, for his moral clarity on this, for his support of Israel with no ifs and buts. And, Congressman Hoyer mentioned President Biden's statement towards Hezbollah and Iran, don't mess with us. And there was a huge sign on one of the highways in Israel with lights and everything, and it just said, it had President Biden's picture and the huge don't on it. So this is the reaction, and we value this stand, and we value very, very much his leadership and his friendship.
Thank you. I think that's pretty clear. I have time for one last question, and it's more of a personal one. And I'm not sure you actually even realize this, but when we were together for lunch or whatever it was, our hour together, the most poignant moment I had, I think, while I was in Israel was you speaking to your son who is in the IDF. And, I understand enough Hebrew to know what, the love that was being communicated from you to him. And I think it's a personal thing. You are doing everything with the president every day to bolster the people of Israel to do what you can, but you also have a personal, stake in all of this too, because your son is in the IDF. Can you talk a little bit about that for you and the president and how you manage to get through every day?
So, as I said before, we're a very small country and everyone is affected. You know someone, you met someone. Unfortunately, we visit many, many bereaved families. And almost each home in Israel has an IDF representative serving somewhere. Many were called to reserve duty on October 7th, as was my son. And of course, especially for mothers of fighters and fathers too, I must add, or the president will get angry. It's not easy. It's not easy worrying about your personal representative in this whole terrible ordeal. But I think doing and being busy keeps one's mind off the personal worry. And we've been very, very busy running all over the country, trying to comfort people, to console them, to hear their problems, to try and solve problems. We've been visiting many of the displaced communities around Israel. By the way, from the north as well. From the south, we've all been discussing that after the October 7th attack, but one should also be aware that there's quite a few communities that usually live on the border with Lebanon, that have been also displaced because of the threat of Hezbollah. And so going back to your personal question, we're all affected, but we personally try to work very hard and hear the people and hug the people. Hugging is a good tool these days. And so doing keeps my mind off my personal worries. But thank you for asking.
No, and I hope first of all, thank you so much for sharing today all of your experience. I think your voice in all of this is one that gives us hope. Your steadfast support, but you are getting a collective hug from everybody on this call. And know that we are with you every single minute. And again, on a personal note, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your taking the time. And if there's anything we can do for you, you know how to get a hold of us.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you very much, all of you, for standing with us.
Yeah, I'd like to turn it over to JDCA Senior Director of Programming and Public Engagement, Bobby Saferstein, who will give some final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you to Representative Hoyer, First Lady of the State of Israel, Michal Herzog, and to each of you for tuning in today and throughout our past briefings and community conversations. Next Wednesday, December 6th at 12 p.m. Eastern, please join us for our 8th community conversation on the crisis in Israel as we welcome Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and Yikar founder and spiritual leader Rabbi Sharon Brous. To sign up, please click on the link in the chat. Also, please mark your calendars for Wednesday, December 13th, the 7th day of Hanukkah, at 12 p.m. Eastern, when we'll be joined by Shalom Hartman Institute International President Yehuda Kurtzer. You can sign up for the link in the chat. As the crisis in Israel unfolds and developments relating to the hostages take place, JDCA will continue providing you with access to leading Jewish and democratic voices to help us understand what's going on and how we can take action. Please visit jewishdems.org to make sure you're signed up to receive the latest updates. While there, we encourage you to visit our Israel Hub and our Take Action page. You'll find JDCA's calls to action, which include 1, emailing your members of Congress, urging them to support President Biden's aid package to Israel and Ukraine. 2, thanking your senators for supporting Israel. And 3, taking action on any of the issues we care about as Jewish Dems. Additionally, we hope you'll sign a petition demanding that UN women condemn Hamas by clicking on the link in the chat. As we conclude today's program, we are grateful, we are hopeful, and we are encouraged by the release of some of the hostages taken by Hamas and by the much needed humanitarian relief for innocent civilians. And we are thankful to President Biden and Democratic leadership in ushering in these resolutions. We call for the safe and speedy return of all the remaining hostages taken from Israel. And we pray for the day when this war is over and Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, and Muslims around the world can live in safety, security, prosperity, and peace. Thank you again for joining us today, and see you next week.